Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Hall. I'm the operations manager here at Benjamin Franklin House, Franklin's only surviving residence located in London. We would like to welcome you all to the December Ben's Book Club, which is the final installment of 2021. We have had quite a varied series of talks over the past year, and tonight we close out 2021 with Running from Bondage by Dr. Karen Cook Bell, who will be in conversation with the Benjamin Franklin House founding director, Dr. Marcia Beliciano. I'll turn it over now to Dr. Beliciano. And just to note, there'll be time for questions and answers at the end. So if you have any questions that come up during the talk, please enter them into the Q&A function on the side of your screen.
Thank you, Michael, and welcome, Karen, if I may. It's really wonderful to have you here. I'm going to invite you to give an overview of your compelling new book, Running from Bondage, Enslaved Women and Their Remarkable Fight for Freedom in Revolutionary America. But I first want to give a little bit of background on your impressive resume. So, Karen, you are Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of History and Government at Bowie State University. And you specialize in slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, and women's history. Your scholarship has appeared in the Journal of African American History, Georgia Historical Quarterly, Passport, U.S. West Africa, Interaction and Relations, Before Obama, a reappraisal of Black Reconstruction era politicians, Converging Identities, Blackness in the Contemporary Diaspora, and Slavery and Freedom in Savannah. You have also published Claiming Freedom, Race, Kinship, and Land in 19th-century Georgia, which won the Georgia Board of Regents Excellence in Research Award. Your current book is published with Cambridge University Press, and you are also editor of Southern Black Women's Struggle for Freedom During the Civil War and Reconstruction, which is under contract with Cambridge University Press. You're also a contributor to Black Perspectives, the blog of the African American Intellectual History Society, and you're a former AAUW dissertation fellow. So Karen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you attendees for being here. So I want to say a few words about Running from Bondage. So Running from Bondage tells the story of enslaved women who escaped or who attempted to escape slavery during the Revolutionary era, a time period when chaos of war and lack of oversight made the escape of Black women possible in both the North and South. In fact, 1/3 of fugitives were enslaved women, according to historian Gary Nash. So my book explains why and how enslaved women escaped slavery and the challenging circumstances they faced over the course of 5 decades from the 1770s to the 1810s. And what brings these chapters together is how Black women are thinking about and acting on their desire for freedom. So I unpack enslaved women's labor during the colonial period and their various resistance strategies, and then take a deep dive into looking at the escape of individual women. And what my book really underscores is the fact that enslaved women were not one-dimensional figures, but lived multi-dimensional lives as wives, mothers, sisters, and freedom fighters. So I began this study several years ago, and the research for this study brought me to the realization that there is so much more that historians can uncover in the lives of enslaved women. Although the evidence is fragmented, the experiences of fugitive women are far from unknowable. I examined over 1,000 runaway slave advertisements, as well as examined trial records of fugitive slaves, and also used an interview with George Washington's escaped slave owner judge. And what I make clear in my book is that instead of viewing Black women at the margins of the American Revolution and abolitionism, it is important to see them as visible participants who put their lives on the line for freedom. They protested with their feet by running away, which underscores the vital role of Black women in seeking to move the nation forward toward a more perfect union. So African Americans, of course, placed great emphasis on the rhetoric of the American Revolution, particularly the right to life and liberty as espoused first by John Locke and later by Thomas Jefferson. So Enlightenment rationalism was a powerful anti-slavery force, which led to the first major challenge to American slavery. Thousands of enslaved people, including women, took advantage of the turmoil caused by the American Revolution to escape slavery, including those enslaved by Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. I argue that motherhood, freedom, and love of family often served as a catalyst for attempted escape. And in fact, enslaved women had as much incentive to run away as did men, and perhaps even more since they were abused physically, sexually, and psychologically. So the scholarship of slave resistance has emphasized viewing slave flight on the same continuum as rebellion and revolt. I take the same approach in my study and demonstrate that women and girls in bondage were not content, and running away was one of the ways in which they protested. Slaveholders lived with this inescapable reality on a consistent basis, and they did everything they could to get their property returned. So posting advertisements in newspapers was the most pervasive method used to secure the return of runaway women and girls. And newspaper advertisements lean heavily toward the physical, offering detailed information about the facial and bodily features of slaves, their origin and ethnicity, where they may have gone, and rewards for their return. The advertisements also reflected on-the-ground collective transformations of names and ethnic changes and identities. In other words, the fugitive body became a living and moving text of victimization, protest, and personhood, as Douglas Brent Chambers has stated. So the underlying causes of women's flight were efforts to protect their bodies and womanhood against the violence and exploitation that was an everyday feature of their lived experience, as well as to protect their children from the harmful effects of slavery. The average age of a self-emancipated woman was 22, and women between the ages of 18 and 25 predominate in the advertisements. Girls as young as 13 escaped independently, and women as old as 62 escaped with their daughters and families. And what was especially surprising is that women also ran away pregnant.
Well, that is really so important that we understand about the experience of these women. I want to start by asking you, is this an overlooked history, and is it wrapped up in, larger questions of gender and scholarship?
Certainly it is overlooked, and scholars of the American Revolution once considered Black participation in the American Revolution to be marginal. However, over the past several decades, numerous books and scholars and articles have really dispelled this idea, and Black participation in the American Revolution is now considered an integral part of the story of American freedom. But the story of women who escaped slavery during the American Revolution has largely not been examined. And a part of the reason why that is the case is because the history books have tended to focus on the experiences of men. Now that began to change with the publication of Deborah Gray White's book, Aren't I a Woman?, which examined the Black female experience during slavery. However, even with this publication, the consensus in the scholarship was that Black women did not flee slavery because of family ties and responsibilities. So in other words, their positions as mothers and wives prevented them from escaping slavery. So I turn this
Thank you. I'm sorry, I had some bandwidth issues. But Karen, in terms of what led you to research, and when you're writing something, it's a huge commitment, isn't it? That you have to really want to engage over a long period of time with the subject matter. And I wonder, if you could talk a little bit about what your motivation was. Where did that come from? And hopefully you are here. I can see myself, but not you, Karen. Bear with us while there we go. Karen's back. Hi. So Karen, I was just asking about, what motivated you to write this book? As you said, there was a misconception around what enslaved women really felt, and that they were pursuing their freedom. But what actually got you on this topic? And when you're writing something, you do have to spend a lot of time. It's a huge commitment, so you've got to love your topic.
Yes, definitely. So my teaching, research, and writing is focused on telling the stories of people who have been marginalized from power and its archive. So I'm a proponent of history from below, in particular, looking at how African Americans navigated slavery and freedom. So researching my first book, Claiming Freedom, some 15 years ago, introduced me to women who fled slavery during the late 18th century. And this led me to question how widespread was the escape of enslaved women. And of course, the American Revolution was a watershed moment in which thousands of enslaved people escaped, and which, according to historian Benjamin Quarles, saw the first large-scale slave rebellion in American history. So, of course, I wanted to tell the story of these women who fled or who attempted to flee slavery during the Revolutionary era. I also believed it was important to take a deep dive into examining the lived experiences of the women who fled, and to think deeply about how they sought to reimagine their world and create new spaces for themselves during a very violent era. So I asked myself what other epistemologies of resistance can be used to complicate the agency of these women. Certainly, when we study the geography of Black spaces, we need to leave open the possibility of a lot of different things. And I thought of Rebecca Scott's term, geography in motion, and how I could create an analytical space for examining fugitive women's mobility or escape during this era. And of course, newspaper advertisements really map fugitive women's geography, detail individual stories, and go to the very reason for attempted escape. I was excited to examine these colonial newspaper advertisements because they provide a window into the world of the women who escaped. And of course, newspaper advertisements by no means reflect the totality of slave flight, since newspaper files are not complete, and enslavers tended to place ads when fugitives were missing for many days or months. Also, newspapers were published in the few urban centers of the period, so that plantations or homes near such centers were the main sources of the advertisements. And there are limits to the advertisements in understanding the lives of enslaved women, since we do not know the ultimate fate of the majority of the individuals who are named in the advertisements.
The things about history is that we can see things in the aggregate, but it becomes much more real when you do have stories. And as you said, some of these women, you have descriptions, but you don't know all that much about them. But in the course of your research, were there certain stories that came to light that really brought this experience for enslaved women to life?
Yeah, so I think all of these stories of women who escaped slavery are really inspirational. But the story of Margaret Grant really stands out. Margaret escaped slavery twice, first in 1770 and again in 1773, both times from Baltimore, Maryland. And in her first escape, she wore men's clothing and sought to conceal her identity by dressing as a waiting boy to an escaped English convict servant named John Chambers. So Margaret sought to escape by passing as both white and male, performing fugitivity in a way that Ellen Craft, another escaped slave, would do decades later. Now, Margaret was a historical outlier. She was literate. She was a mulatto. She had experienced slavery on 3 Caribbean islands, and she escaped twice from Baltimore. So through a close reading of the ads, we know a great deal about her life up to the time of her escape. Now, the use of her surname by Margaret reflects her acculturation and anglicization. We don't know the circumstances surrounding how she came to use the surname Grant, but the use of her surname indicates that she sought to portray a sense of dignity and freedom. Now, Jenny is another enslaved woman who is featured in chapter 3 of Running from Bondage, and her story is also inspiring. She was the mother of 2-year-old Winnie, and she escaped slavery from Virginia in 1776 while she was big with child, according to the advertisement for her escape. Jenny and her child were on the run for 7 months when her enslaver placed a second advertisement for her escape. Her enslaver also noted that she would attempt to pass as a free woman and was likely headed to Richmond, Virginia, which had a comparatively large free Black population. And at the end of my book, I discuss a woman named Hannah who escaped slavery twice and lost 2 children to exposure. She was recaptured, and her enslaver, Mary Bowie, petitioned the court in Westmoreland, Virginia, to have her sold because of her recidivism. So Hannah's story is one of loss, but also of perseverance and persistence. And each of these stories really are a necessary act of recovery from the trauma in the archive of Black women's experiences.
They were so brave, weren't they?
Indeed, they were. And, women who escaped slavery really defy the narrative that women were tied to their enslavers through their children, because what I found in my research is that women are also running away with their children. And of course, in some cases, like the case of Margaret, when she ran away the second time, she was pregnant. So despite the obstacles that having children and being pregnant presented, these women took bold and daring action to gain their freedom.
So can you set your story in the wider context of the American Revolutionary period?
Certainly. So the American Revolution was based on the premise of freedom, of course, for the colonies from the control of the British monarchy, and the ideals embodied in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness resonated with enslaved women who used the rhetoric of the revolution to claim their right to freedom. Women heard about these ideals from listening to the conversations of their enslavers, as well as through the slave grapevine, which carried news from plantation to plantation and indeed from city to city. The American Revolution brought into sharp focus the paradox of slavery and freedom, and African American women contributed mightily to the story of American independence because they too believed in the independence of the individual, and they valued in the most fundamental way what Thomas Jefferson and others would identify as inalienable rights. So despite the limitations placed on enslaved women, they were able to contest their bondage through the liminal spaces of slavery, and the pronouncement of Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775 and the Philipsburg Proclamation in 1779, offering freedom to escaped slaves who would aid the Loyalist cause, led to the escape of thousands of enslaved women as well as men. So the revolution affirmed the idea that freedom was a universal birthright, and Black women seized upon every opportunity to undermine the system of slavery through flight. During the war, women not only fled in family groups, but also in groups without established kin relations. They correctly perceived that their best chances for freedom resided with a British victory, and a disruption of the existing social order. Also of significance during this period were the leading theoreticians of the revolution, such as James Otis, Isaac Skillman, and Anthony Benezet, who argued that enslaved people had every right to rebel against the system and that there could never be legal title in the ownership of another human being. They correctly saw that the Declaration of Independence was based on a noble ideal and also a falsehood, that the men who comprised the Committee of Five to draft the Declaration were well aware of the contradiction in demanding freedom for themselves while depriving others of their freedom. And in fact, patriots often use the term slave to describe their relationship with Great Britain. Now, the use of the term slave as a metaphor for the condition of white patriots meant that abolition would not be a part of the revolutionary cause. And of course, slavery continued for nearly 100 years after the revolution.
Well, it's an interesting issue for Benjamin Franklin House, because we have to look at the story of Franklin, who owned enslaved people and was born into a time when this institution was widely accepted, but actually it's the time that he comes to London, those nearly 16 years that he was in Craven Street between 1762 and 1764, engaging with abolitionists like Granville Sharp or the dissenting minister Richard Price and others, that really changed his mindset, I think, or began to trigger something. He also was part of something called the Gray Associates, which was a group that Dr. Johnson, he of the dictionary, was involved with as well, about educating former Black slaves, seemed to help them on their journey as free people. But I wonder if you can, well, and let me just close off that thought by saying, you know, we, to your point about the trade-offs, the unholy trade-offs that were made on the Constitution and with the Declaration of Independence, knowing that states in the South where there was slavery, you know, we might not have had a union, but Franklin at least takes a stand and serves as the president for the Pennsylvania Society for the Promotion of the Abolition of Slavery in, you know, nearly 100 years before the Civil War. I want to come back to what the women's experience was like. So I'm imagining, okay, as a mother myself, I can't conceive of leaving my children behind. I'm picturing these women under the cover of night, and what were their obstacles in their pursuit of freedom? And was it as simple as you get over the border into a state like Massachusetts and then, you know, life is good, or did somebody try and return you? So what was that experience like?
Well, certainly enslaved women faced many obstacles, from environmental to physical, and challenges related to the nature of warfare. In terms of environmental challenges, enslaved women who were escaping slavery had to contend, of course, with the elements, be it extreme heat or cold. In terms of physical challenges, they had to contend with the topography, the forests, the creeks, the swamps, and the rivers. And in terms of the nature of warfare, there were challenges with regard to remaining in British encampments. In Virginia, diseases such as smallpox led to the death of scores of women and men on Gwynn Island in Virginia. But after the Revolutionary War, there were tremendous obstacles to freedom. Certainly, those obstacles were presented by the US Constitution. Article 4, Section 2 of the US Constitution provided for the capture and return of runaways. And the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 gave enforcement power to this clause by allowing enslavers to capture and return the runaways. In fact, President George Washington used this act to pursue his runaway slave owner judge, who escaped in 1796 from the Washington's home in Philadelphia, which was then the nation's capital. Ona successfully escaped to New Hampshire, where she lived out the remainder of her life until she died in 1848. And after several attempts to recapture her, the Washingtons eventually gave up their pursuit. So women had to contend with several obstacles to gaining their freedom. And what is important to underscore about the Revolutionary period is that we do have the development of gradual manumission laws to end slavery in states such as Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. The state constitutions abolished slavery immediately. And in other northern states like New York and New Jersey, they enacted gradual manumission laws in 1799 and in 1804. So slavery, of course, did not end instantly through these laws, with the exception of Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, but was maintained for a period of as long as 28 years. So reaching a free state was certainly the desired way in which enslaved women who were escaping slavery sought to gain their freedom. But women also sought to secure their freedom in the urban spaces of the South, such as Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, Louisiana, where they pursued what I call an informal freedom, freedom that did not exist on paper, that was not legal, but which they pursued through other means.
Let me just remind our listeners that you can type into the chat function or into the Q&A any questions that you have for Karen. Karen, given the focus of this book on enslaved women, was there a difference in the experience of enslaved men who were pursuing their freedom? And if so, what was that difference?
Certainly, in terms of distinctions, women faced unique challenges because, again, most of them escaped with their children. They did not want to leave their children behind. And in fact, in many cases, women are escaping with their families, with their husbands as well, and some escaped to join their husbands who were fighting with the British. This was certainly the case for many women who were escaping from Virginia and from Maryland. So women faced different challenges than men with regard to escaping slavery. And certainly for men escaping slavery, they too wanted to ensure that their families would be with them. And what we see happening after Dunmore's proclamation is that families are trying to reach Lord Dunmore off the Chesapeake Bay, so that family units are actually escaping together in many cases.
So the primary material that you used to uncover this history, has it been buried, or was it always there in plain view? It's just that scholars had not really engaged with that content. And where did you find it? And were there any surprises that surprised you as you looked at the primary source material?
Right, so I would argue that, and certainly in my research, that fugitive women are really not missing from the historical record. They are there, but their experiences have not been fully excavated by historians. And I would also argue that they are not really silent in the sources, because when you look at trial records, women are giving expert witnesses testimony for these trial records. So I think that in terms of the presence of women in the archive, they are there, but they have not been fully excavated by historians. So the challenge for me was not locating sources on enslaved women's escape, but making sense of the available fragmented evidence. So I would read my sources, for example, for the political and symbolic significance of clothes that fugitive women took with them or wore as they fled. And enslaved women like Margaret Grant, for example, appropriated the tools of the master, including his dress, to dismantle their enslavement. So because newspaper ads tended to be incomplete and fragmented, I've had to navigate how to work with the list-like quality of the ads and to engage in an imaginative reconstruction deeply rooted in textual scholarship of fugitive women's lived experiences. I've had to read into the silences because that is where we can find women's lives, and also embrace the idea that silences can be made to speak for themselves. So the case of Margaret Grant, again, in particular, reveals that runaway slave advertisements can allow historians to pull back the layers of the printed word to interrogate the experiences of women whose voices have been silent, but whose actions have cried out for interpretation.
Is it in a particular location? Where are these archives?
Okay, so Lathan Windley, historian Lathan Windley, has a multi-volume publication of enslaved women and men's escape. And what he did was excavate materials from the archives from colonial newspaper advertisements and compiled them into a multi-volume publication. And this publication covers every Southern state. So I used Lathan Windley's 4th volume compilation of documentary runaway newspaper advertisements, as well as use digital databases. With new technology, historians have access to an abundance of digital resources. So the Slavery and Petitions Project at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill is a very important resource to use that has a database of runaway slave advertisements. Also, the Freedom on the Move Project at Cornell University is an important resource that has a database of runaway slave advertisements. And of course, in terms of trial records, they're available at state and university archives. So the records are in abundance, and it's really a question of excavating the resources and the evidence to reconstruct and examine the lived experiences of the women who escaped slavery, which was my ultimate goal.
And I think, oh, there we go. I don't know if you heard that. I think we were.
No, I didn't hear it. I think it froze.
Okay, so I was asking why does this history matter? And what is the connection to the world in which we live today and some of the movements that we've seen in recent years on gender, women taking a stand, for example, through the Me Too movement, or Black Lives Matter as a protesting that they need to feel equal protection under the law, and have the rights that is the birthright as we interpret make that connection for us between the importance of this past and its connection with things that we're living through today.
Certainly. So these stories of Black women's escape teach us what it means to engage in social justice. Black women throughout history have used their pain to inspire change. And I think about Mamie Till, the mother of Emmett Till, whose son was lynched and who insisted on an open casket, which helped launch the civil rights movement. I think about Trayvon Martin's mother, Sabrina Fulton. Trayvon Martin was killed by a neighborhood watchman for simply walking through his father's neighborhood. And Sabrina Fulton really helped launch this social justice movement on behalf of her son. And I think about Lucy Macbeth, whose son, Jordan Davis, was shot to death, and she's now a member of Congress advocating for gun control. So history is a source of power, and these stories of Black women's escape disrupt the master narratives. So I've always said that this story is also an important part of Black women's political history, which really adds to the discourse of how Black women organized in their communities, protested slavery and segregation, built institutions, and fought for equal access to the ballot. Black women have been in the forefront of moves to address inequity, social oppression, and freedom for the Black community for centuries. And I would argue this is a fight that began during the Revolutionary Era. And it's really not surprising that, given America's revolutionary heritage, that slavery has long captured the collective historical consciousness of the nation. So telling the stories of fugitive women is an act of recovery for understanding the ethical and racial foundations of the nation. It has been 245 years since Thomas Jefferson issued the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming that all men are created equal and have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet America is still struggling to live up to these ideals enshrined in that document. So both successful and attempted escapes of enslaved women matter to the present day discourse on freedom and equality, as evidenced by the Black Lives Matter movement, which was started by 3 Black women, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, to fight for freedom, liberation, and justice.
I have a question from Tom McAndrew, who wants to know whether you found any correlation between battlefield activity and women fleeing from respective areas. For example, were women actively fleeing from South Carolina in 1777, or did they mostly wait until the British started the Southern campaign later in the war?
So that's a good question. There were regional variations and similarities in the flight of enslaved women during the Revolution. Women did not wait, for example, in South Carolina and Georgia for the Southern campaign. They had been escaping to Florida, where the Spanish had previously provided freedom and refuge for escaped slaves who reached St. Augustine. But of course, when the British launched the Southern campaign, the intensity of women's flight increased, and they found refuge with British troops following the Southern campaign of 1778, 1779. So in Virginia and Maryland, enslaved women sought to reach Philadelphia, which was under the control of British forces, in September of 1777, as well as to reach other northern destinations. And in the northern and New England colonies, women sought to reach British forces during the early campaigns of the war, during the Siege of Boston, for example, and also endeavored to reach New York City. So in each of these regions, fugitive women also endeavored to pass as free women.
So we have another question about whether some enslaved women and their families traveled to Britain after the Revolution, and what sort of life would have awaited them there, if so?
Yes, so that's an excellent question as well. I think of Mary Perth and her daughter Patience, who were among the group that fled to Dunmore in 1776 following his proclamation. They were able to reach New York, and in New York, Mary married Caesar Perth, and the family immigrated to Nova Scotia, where, of course, some 3,000 other African Americans also immigrated following the end of the Revolutionary War. But in Nova Scotia, as many African Americans found, life was very difficult because of poor farmland. And as a result, many, including Mary, left Nova Scotia and immigrated to Sierra Leone, where Mary set up a boarding house. and became a domestic in the home of a man named Zachary Macaulay. Zachary Macaulay then went on to leave Sierra Leone, and Mary went with him, and her daughter Patience went with him. Caesar died in the 1790s, but the family did make their way to England with Zachary Macaulay until Patience died in England, and Mary returned to Sierra Leone, where she, of course, lived and died as well. So certainly this migration of Black people from North America to Nova Scotia, to the Caribbean, where unfortunately many were enslaved, and then to Sierra Leone, is an important part of the effort by African Americans to establish themselves in international free soul havens, to use Elena Abbott's terminology for describing how African Americans really had this persistent idea of freedom beyond America's borders and into places like Canada, into even Haiti, as well as Sierra Leone and later Liberia.
So I'm wondering about what you're going to be focusing on next. It's a bit of an unfair question because you've just produced this amazing book, but have you already begun to think about what you want to be writing about, and will it be an extension of this book?
Yeah, so my next project is actually a collection of essays that I'm editing and also contributing on Black women and how they navigated slavery and freedom during the Civil War and Reconstruction period. That book is under contract with Cambridge University Press, but I would also like to develop a project on the ways in which African American women sought to escape slavery during the 1800s and the obstacles and challenges that they faced. So, an expansion of my current book, Running from Bondage, is certainly an extension of looking at the ways that the antebellum period created either opportunities or obstacles for Black women, because what we see in the literature is that running away was easier during the colonial period than it was during the antebellum period or the 1800s, because over time, white society grew more adept at tracking and capturing runaway slaves. So I would love to develop a project that looks at enslaved women's efforts to escape slavery during one of the most really challenging times and really the most difficult time for African Americans during the 1800s in terms of slave laws and in terms of other aspects of slavery that were detrimental to Black people.
Well, Dr. Karen Cook-Bell, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a fascinating conversation. We'll be excited to watch for your future scholarship, and thank you for sharing so much. Before we do close, I see we have one more question here from Tom McAndrew. I want to make sure we capture that. Of the 1,000 people you tracked in your research, how many of them ended up being in the British Book of Negroes at the end of the war? What was that like?
Right. So 30% of the women who are featured in the Book of Negroes, of course, escaped slavery during the 1770s and the early 1780s. So of those 3,000, persons who are listed in the Book of Negroes, 30% were fugitive women and children. And that really is the majority of those captured in the Book of Negroes.
Well, thank you very much for answering that question. And in fact, thank you for answering all of the questions that I put to you today. It's been absolutely fascinating, and we wish you the best of luck as you continue in your research and writing. Let me just remind our listeners that we will have a exciting program of events, virtual events as well. We'll see what the situation is like for any type of hybrid activities where we can be in Benjamin Franklin House and have some live audience. If we can't do that during the winter months, we certainly will look to do that in the spring. But thank you once again, Karen, for joining us today. It's been fascinating to speak with you.
Thank you for having me.